Coming up on Arirang News, the U.S. has agreed with South Korea's proposal to send humanitarian food aid to North Korea. Undecided still when or how much, but there are hopes this could help get diplomacy back on track. The U.S. is set to ramp up its tariffs on China this Friday, claiming Beijing has gone back on its word. In the meantime, top Chinese officials are in Washington for one more try at a trade deal. And with inflation far below the target last quarter, the Bank of Korea says it's going to stick with its accommodative monetary policy for now. The U.S.-China trade conflict a factor in that decision, too. It's 4 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning into our afternoon newscast. I'm Devin Whiting. In his phone call earlier this week with South Korean President Moon Jae-in, U.S. President Donald Trump expressed support for sending food aid to North Korea. Now the big question is whether this gesture of food for the North will help bring it back to talks. Time will tell, but in the meantime, South Korea has started the process of getting the aid ready, which includes deciding how much to send. Our EG1 has more.
As South Korea and the U.S. reaffirmed their support for food aid to North Korea, Seoul has announced its plans to begin reviewing the process of sending the aid. A key Blue House official told reporters Wednesday that it is now starting to review the humanitarian food aid to the North. Seoul's Unification Ministry also said that it will proceed with the aid through close coordination with the international community. But it added that it's not yet at a stage to share how much aid will be given or how it will be delivered. The United Nations World Food Programme and Food and Agriculture Organization conducted an on-site assessment in April, and according to that assessment, 10 million people, about 40% of North Korea's population, are suffering from food shortages caused by heat waves, floods, and landslides. Roughly 1.4 million tons of food aid is said to be needed. North Korea also requested support from international organizations. Up until 2016, South Korea had, through international organizations including the World Food Programme, been providing the North with aid worth an annual average of $11.8 million. The current Moon administration had also planned to provide the North with aid worth $8 million through UNICEF and the World Food Programme in 2017. But due to increased tensions with the North that year, the plan was never carried out and was eventually scrapped. And now with South Korea and the U.S. showing willingness and support in providing the North with food assistance, there are hopes that this could lead to some progress in the current stalemate between Pyongyang and Washington. However, experts are skeptical about whether this could actually bring the North back to the negotiating table and lead to a breakthrough in the denuclearization talks.
The humanitarian aid was already an exemption from the UN sanctions. Providing the North with food assistance is not significant enough to change the North's attitude.
The expert, however, added that North Korea previously responded to the food aid with humanitarian inter-Korean exchanges, such as reunions for separated families. Thus, with inter-Korean exchanges at a standstill, the aid may be able to spark something on that front. 이지원, Arirang News.
The White House spokesperson said more specifically on Wednesday that if South Korea sends the North food, the U.S. will not intervene. The regime is going through one of its worst food shortages in a decade. Kim Ji-yeon has this report.
Washington has confirmed that U.S. President Donald Trump had expressed support for Seoul's possible humanitarian assistance to North Korea during a phone call with President Moon Jae-in. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders told reporters Wednesday that Washington's primary focus remains on North Korea's denuclearization. Sanders said the U.S. will continue with its maximum pressure campaign against the regime, but said that it would not intervene in Seoul's move to send food aid to North Korea, despite the recent firing of weapons from Pyongyang earlier this month.
Our position in regards to North Korea is going to continue to be the maximum pressure campaign. Our focus is on the denuclearization. If South Korea moves forward on that front, we're not going to intervene.
Talks are being held in Seoul on Thursday between U.S. Special Representative for North Korea Stephen Biegun and his South Korean counterpart Lee Do-hoon on Seoul's possible provision of humanitarian food aid to the North, as well as North Korea's firing of short-range projectiles earlier this month. Biegun arrived in Seoul Wednesday in his first visit to South Korea since the North Korea-U.S. summit in February ended without an agreement. Begin and Lee are to meet again on Friday for the Seoul-Washington Working Group meeting. The U.S. envoy will also meet South Korea's ministers of foreign affairs and unification and visit the Blue House on Friday. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says, meanwhile, that the international community must continue the pressure campaign on North Korea as an imperative for the security of the world. According to VOA, Pompeo, speaking in London on Wednesday, highlighted the importance of the Trump administration's diplomatic efforts to achieve the final, fully verified denuclearization of the regime. Pompeo also thanked the British Navy for deploying its assets to the Pacific to deter illegal ship-to-ship transfers of North Korean fuel, which are a violation of UN sanctions. Officials from South Korea, the U.S., and Japan are meeting in Seoul on this Thursday to discuss military cooperation and regional security issues, with North Korea's recent firing of projectiles likely to top the agenda. Seoul's defense ministry says the 11th defense trilateral talks are being attended by South Korea's Deputy Minister for National Defense Policy, Jung Seok-hwan, and his U.S. and Japanese counterparts, Randall Shriver and Takeshi Ishikawa. Also there are the U.S. State Department's acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Japan and Korean Affairs, Mark Napper. Prior to the meeting, the U.S. and Japan held bilateral talks at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul. These talks come at a time when military relations between South Korea and Japan have soured after Tokyo claimed a South Korean warship locked its radar onto a low-flying Japanese maritime patrol aircraft late last year. Seoul strongly denies that claim. President Moon Jae-in will go on live TV tonight to outline his administration's plans in a range of areas, from politics and the economy to North Korea. He's marking 2 years in office tomorrow. It'll be a one-on-one interview with a reporter from KBS, and it'll be broadcast live from Cheongwade. It airs from 8:30 to 9:50 p.m. Korea time. Arirang News will also broadcast the interview live with simultaneous English translation. Markets have been rattled this week over tensions between the U.S. and China over trade. With new tariffs looming, talks are set for Thursday. President Trump is blaming China for breaking a deal they had apparently almost reached. Kim Hye-sung reports.
U.S. President Donald Trump has accused China of breaking the deal in the ongoing U.S.-China trade talks. Speaking at a campaign rally in Florida on Wednesday, President Trump attributed his recent threat of tariff increases to Beijing's negotiating position.
The vice premier tomorrow is flying in, good man, but they broke the deal. They can't do that. So I just announced that we'll increase tariffs on China. And we won't back down until China stops cheating our workers and stealing our jobs.
Trump threatened to impose additional tariffs on Chinese goods in a Twitter post last weekend, accusing China of backtracking on provisions of a draft trade deal. On Wednesday, local time, the U.S. Trade Representative's office filed paperwork to raise tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese imports to 25% from the previous 10%, effective this coming Friday. In response, China's Commerce Ministry said it will take necessary countermeasures, adding that it deeply regrets the Trump administration's latest action. Already, the two sides have exchanged tariffs on over $360 billion worth of goods in two-way trade since last year. Officials have been locked in negotiations for about 5 months after Trump agreed to put off the January 1st scheduled increase on tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese goods while talks between the two sides resume. Washington has called on Beijing to make sweeping changes to its trade and regulatory practices, including protection over U.S. intellectual property, curbs on Chinese government subsidies, and increased market access to China. While trade tensions escalate, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said Wednesday that the U.S. has received indication that China wants to make a deal, adding they will sit down with the Chinese delegation, including Vice Premier Liu He, on Thursday, and see what happens from there. Kim Hye-sung, Arirang News.
The Bank of Korea says it's going to stick with an accommodative monetary policy stance for the time being. In its monetary policy report for May, the central bank said global trade is slowing down, pointing to the U.S.-China trade war, which hurts local exports and domestic economic growth. South Korea's consumer price inflation for the first quarter was 0.5%, well below the BOK's 2% target. The Bank of Korea has kept its key rate unchanged at 1.75% in its two monetary policy meetings this year and said it will closely monitor the capital market and geopolitical risks when making any changes to its monetary policy. It's time now for a look at the market action here in Korea and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Kiwoom Securities. Mr. Yu, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me today.
Well, let's start with Wall Street. Another session of pretty big losses there overnight, again on the U.S.-China trade tensions. Take us through the action, not only on Wall Street, but here in Asia, too.
Sure. Generally, the global market continues to show some volatilities because of the U.S.-China trade dispute. And there's no final answers yet. As we know that they'll be meeting tonight in Korea time, discussing in terms of the further trade to be continued. Trade discussion will be continued. Vice Minister He and Chinese negotiators are meeting basically to discuss the terms once again. But what market is waiting until any concrete results to be released by the end of this week. As you know, Trump have said that they will raise the tariff on Friday, so we need to watch and how that's played out. That is, continue to put some tolls on the overall market. If you look at the overall Korean market, it's down more than 3% today. Kosdaq is down 2.84%. Also, Chinese market seems to be going down continuously in the last several days. It's down about 1.25% again today. Also, towards the end of yesterday's trading, Intel guidance were coming out, and there's concern about the semiconductor industries in terms of whether the recovery can be happening in the second half of this year. Due to that, Korean market, particularly Samsung Electronics and SK hynix, have shown a significant drop today. Also, because of the option maturity date was today, and that has resulted into a significant decline. And Hynix was down 5.35%, and Samsung was down more than 4%.
Yeah, so stocks down across the board pretty much in the region and in the U.S. because of fears over these tariffs that might come on Friday. Where do you see things going if they do come, if they don't come?
Yes, in terms of the tariff, I think that if it comes, it will be coming in a very short period of time rather than a long term. Now, continuously, the global market is still worried about the U.S.-China trade war. And if the tariff is raised, the pressure on inflation will be very high for U.S. We estimate that inflation will go up by more than 0.5% from the current 2% stable level of inflation. This means that the possibility of the rate cut by Fed is unlikely the case. That's why it is putting quite a significant pressure for Trump if he does raise the tariff. So everybody knows that the continuation of China-U.S. trade war is a no-win situation for both countries. So we think that the settlement will come in eventually. Just question is when it's going to happen. The timing is most important. We think that the likely scenario is that a China delegate visiting U.S., the discussion will be well made and good negotiation will happen. And the U.S. might delay the tariff increase, or if there is one, it could be a very short-term one. And then China will probably meet the large sum of U.S. demand in regards to the intellectual property rights. And then lastly, probably U.S. and China signing the treaty before the end of first half of this year. We think that the Trump election next year is going to put some pressure for Trump, as well as Xi Jinping also 70-year celebration for his government is putting some pressure as well. So we think that currently there's uncertainty continuing on, but nevertheless, we think that the uncertainty will disappear over the next 1 month or so.
Well, you mentioned inflation and how that'll be affected by the tariffs. Here in Korea, the central bank is worried about inflation being so low. There's talk about a possible cut in interest rates. This seems like something investors would welcome. What's the feeling out there now?
Yes, I think that Korea probably needs more aggressive government policy to boost the economies. The current announcement about the fiscal policy of 7 trillion won or so of the supplementary budget is not enough, we think. Also, I think we need some kind of rate cut in order to see domestic economy to some recoveries. However, though, as you know, there is a concern about the currencies. Korean won has been depreciating. It's already well above 1170 level. And everybody's talking about possibility of it going to 1200. And because of that, the foreign outflow of money can actually happen. So BOK is a bit of stuck in a situation. But nevertheless, we think that the government boosting the overall policies in terms of monetary and fiscal policy is a necessity in order to see a GDP growth rate well over 2.5%. For the time being, the market seems to be at trading a very cheap valuation because of the economic growth rates continue to be a concern. But the boosting measures do come in, and then that will have some positive impact to the Korean market. So for the time being, people are basically watching out on the sideline and see what's happening to the interest rate as well as the inflation and the rates.
Got it. Well, that's where we'll have to leave it today, Mr. Yu. Thanks so much for your insights today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Well, yet another data point is out reflecting the slowdown in the Korean economy last quarter. Statistics Korea says the supply of manufactured goods fell by more than 4%, mainly due to less facility investment in semiconductors. Kim Dami has the details.
South Korea's total supply in manufacturing dropped 4.1% in the first quarter from a year earlier, another sign of weakening demand in Asia's fourth largest economy. The Manufacturing Domestic Supply Index, which measures both local and imported goods, marked 98.7 during the January to March period, after increasing by almost 3% in the fourth quarter of 2018. Statistics Korea, who compiled the data, blames the on-year decline on a sharp fall in investment in semiconductor equipment and also noted huge investment in semiconductors in the first quarter last year. Investment in capital goods also dropped by around 23% on-year. Capital goods are machines and equipment used for production for more than a year and are another indicator of investment in the manufacturing industry. It's the sharpest fall since the data was first collected in 2010. While the supply of locally made goods fell almost 4%, imported products also declined 4.3% on-year, mainly due to a decline in imports of mechanical equipment. By industry, local supply in mechanical and transport equipment saw particularly steep drops at 20% and 44% respectively. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
Again, tomorrow is 2 years since President Moon Jae-in took office. And in that time, his stated agenda has been to improve people's livelihoods, revitalize the economy, and boost inter-Korean relations. His administration has made some progress in those areas, but experts say there's still more to do. Park Hee-jun has this report.
A people-centered economy. The Moon Jae-in administration's economic vision has been credited with improving labor productivity and quality of life through the reduction of working hours and a minimum wage hike. But recent data show unsatisfactory trends in areas including exports and real GDP. During a policy conference Tuesday to evaluate the Moon government's first 2 years in office, experts raised concerns over such negative economic figures. And the solution they proposed was innovative growth.
Income-led growth is a short-term solution that affects the country's potential growth rate. To achieve long-term economic development, the government needs to focus on continuing policies related to technology development and innovative growth.
At the center of such policy should be small and mid-sized companies, the backbone of employment and new growth engines. Such advice is in line with President Moon's current economic direction. But not enough is being done, and the government has a long way to go in supporting the business environment of such companies, especially concerning their competitiveness.
Starting a company and developing it into a large company is considered the heart of innovative growth. But small and mid-sized companies' productivity only amounts to 30% of that of large companies. Smart factories can be the most effective solution to that.
And although South Korea is leading in the data industry and with the 5G network, it's falling behind in other areas, mainly artificial intelligence. While the U.S. has more than 1,000 AI companies and Japan over 100, South Korea has just about 40. Experts emphasize the need for drastic measures that can increase the country's competitiveness in fields related to the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is to be the main source of economic growth from here on. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
The mayor of Seoul, Park Won-sun, is back from an 8-day trip to Europe and the Middle East. He was not only promoting the Korean capital as a place to invest, but also looking for innovative ways to improve the lives of the people of Seoul. Won Jung-hwan reports.
The keyword for this trip was innovative startups, one of the main tasks that Seoul's mayor has on its mind to foster economic growth. Mayor Park Won-sun visited 3 cities to build partnerships and learn the latest in innovative policies. His first stop was Abu Dhabi, where he worked on a concrete plan for the Upcycle landmark scheme, which the 2 cities agreed to cooperate on last February. The scheme aims to build city-to-city partnerships on the issue of environmental sustainability, particularly focusing on fine dust. Park then headed to London, one of the world's main finance hubs, which is home to more than 5,000 financial services companies. His visit came during the city's FinTech Week, a week-long series of events and discussions on finance-related issues such as Brexit, artificial intelligence, and investment. Seoul's mayor spoke to more than 100 representatives of financial services corporations in Britain, inviting them to invest in Korea. While laying out his plans to further develop the fintech industry in Seoul's finance hub, Yeouido, he proposed funding to help international financial services companies establish branch offices in Seoul. Financial services companies with more than 4 employees that are able to attract more than $85,000 of investment can apply for free office space at the hub. For the final stop on his trip, Park visited Israel, one of the world's leaders in innovative startup businesses, to have talks with CEOs of global IT venture capital companies such as the Yozma Group. He asked for advice on policy roadmaps to make Seoul a more innovative city, while planning for cooperation between Israeli firms and firms stationed in Seoul. And to help make all this happen, the Seoul metropolitan government signed a memorandum of understanding with the largest city and financial center of Israel, Tel Aviv, on Monday to better promote friendship and cooperation between the 2 cities. Through this trip to Abu Dhabi, London, and Tel Aviv, Mayor Park hopes to get a better idea on how to tackle the day-to-day issues that Seoul's citizens face and improve employment, the environment, and of course, living standards. Won Jung-hwan, Arirang News.
South Korea got more tourists last year than the year before. Almost all of them said they'd come for the shopping, and the vast majority of them also for the food. Data show they stayed longer than in previous years, too. Our Chen Xi-young has the latest on Korea's tourism trends.
According to the latest data released by the Culture Ministry and Korea Tourism Organization, around 15 million tourists visited South Korea last year, a 15% jump from a year earlier when China put a travel ban on group tours to South Korea with a THAAD anti-missile shield SPAD. And the tourists stayed in South Korea longer than the previous year too, staying for an average of 7.2 days. Out of 16,000 visitors surveyed at international airports by the ministry, around 92.5% said they came for shopping, while 71.3% said they came to taste the local food. The most visited place was Seoul, followed by Gyeonggi-do Province, Busan, Gangwon-do Province, and Jeju-do Island. Gangwon-do Province saw a bump in visitors due to the Pyeongchang 2018 Winter Olympics. The survey also said most of the tourists got travel information from their friends or colleagues. Once they arrive in Korea, most of them search for information on their smartphone. But the survey also showed visitors most needed information on travel distances and transportation details, followed by information on local restaurants. The data indicates more foreign guests visit places other than the capital Seoul and that they stay longer to shop and taste local food. The government said it will address the inconveniences mentioned by the foreign visitors. Choi Xiong, Arirang News.
The ride-sharing company Uber is doing its IPO on Friday, but in a protest, its drivers are on a worldwide strike. Most of the strikes will happen in the U.S. in cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, and Chicago, to name a few. Uber drivers in London and Sao Paulo have also joined in. The drivers are unhappy with low wages, reduced fares, and more cars on the roads. This as Uber is set to offer a staggering $90 billion in stocks. Drivers from its competitor Lyft have also joined the protest. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thanks for being with us. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.